Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Social Sciences, SOSS. Master of Arts, Economics, MEC. Second year, MEC 106 Public Economics. Block 1 Basic Concepts of Public Economics. UNIT 2 Market Failure and Government Failure, 2.0 Objectives. After reading this unit, you will be able to define the term efficiency. Show how conditions of perfectly competitive markets ensure maximum welfare. State the standard factors which cause market failure. Discuss why externalities warrant government intervention. Outline how imperfect competition leads to welfare loss, stating the policy. Options open to government to rectify the situation. Elucidate the feature of market failure in case of public goods. Highlight the importance of minimizing asymmetric information to cope with the consequences of inefficiency. Explain how direct democracy does not guarantee welfare maximization. Argue why representative democracies fail to implement efficient policies for maximum welfare, and critique why democracy and bureaucracy work in collusion to increase welfare only in intent but in reality achieve only suboptimal welfare. 2.1 Introduction. One of the central questions of public policy is, when should the government intervene in the working of markets? If the market works perfectly well, then there is no justification for government intervention. In such a situation, the policy of laissez-faire could be the best. However, if markets fail to achieve the desired goals, there is a case for government intervention. Hence, a crucial question is, when do markets fail and what should the government do to mitigate the effects of market failure? Critics of government intervention point out that the government may not actually do what it should do. This may be due to vested interests or frictions in the decision-making process of the government. This would mean the failure of the government to rectify the problems of market failure. The present unit deals with these two subjects of market failure and government failure. Specifically, it answers the questions: what do they mean? When do they arise? Why do they arise? And what lessons can be learned for future policy? In the first part, we discuss the meaning and causes of market failure. Thereafter, we discuss why and when there may be cases of government failure. 2.2 Market efficiency. In economics, the predominant criterion used to analyze the case of market failure is that of efficiency. The term efficiency is in turn related to the concept of welfare. Welfare, as defined in economics, is the difference between what the members of a society are willing to pay for a given quantity of the product minus what it costs the society to produce that quantity. It can also be seen as the sum of the consumer's surplus and producer's surplus. This is because, in most cases, the difference between willingness to pay (WTP) and cost of production is shared by both consumers and firms. Efficiency is, therefore, related to the idea that welfare is maximum or no group in society, e.g. consumers, can be made better off without making another group, e.g. producers, worse off. In other words, consumers' surplus cannot be increased without reducing producers' surplus and vice versa. Free and perfectly competitive markets are assumed to maximize welfare, i.e. they are efficient. The demand curve of the perfectly competitive market is the sum of very large number of consumers WTP. The WTP indicates the maximum price the consumers are prepared to pay for various quantities of goods sold in the market. It is therefore the same as the market demand curve, which answers the question of what quantities can be sold at different prices. On the supply side, a perfectly competitive market is characterized by the existence of a very large number of firms, each a price taker, that produce homogeneous outputs with a technology that results in rising marginal costs. Hence, in the long run, firms can costlessly exit or enter the given industry. Other assumptions made on perfectly competitive markets include perfect knowledge about products, prices, technology and free movement of factors of production and consumers to maximize their gains. Under these rather stringent and restrictive assumptions, a perfectly competitive market reaches the equilibrium price, Fig. 2.1. At the equilibrium price P, the market clears in the sense that at that price the quantity demanded by consumers equals the quantity the firms are willing to supply, i.e. demand equals supply. Welfare being the difference between WTP and cost of production is measured by the area which lies above the supply curve, or MC curve, and below the demand curve, or WTP curve, for any given quantity. In such a situation, for the equilibrium quantity OQ, welfare equals the areas arbed, the maximum welfare possible. If more than Q quantities are produced, the cost to society will be greater than what consumers are willing to pay, thereby reducing welfare. Likewise, for quantities less than Q, such as Q1, there will be a reduction in welfare depicted by the area RST, called a deadweight loss of welfare. Increasing output from Q1 to Q would therefore increase welfare. Thus, in a perfectly competitive market, the market ensures maximum welfare and therefore, there is no case, on the ground of efficiency, for government intervention. Look at the screen. Fig. 2.1 Equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market. 2.3 Market failure. Competitive market efficiency is therefore based on a number of restrictive assumptions. When these assumptions are violated, the markets fail to reach an efficient outcome. Specifically, this would happen in cases of I. Externalities, E. Imperfect competition, E. Public goods, and IV. Imperfect information. The present section examines each of these cases, pointing out what instruments are implemented to work as solutions in such situations. 2.3.1 Externality. An externality arises when members of the society, other than those directly involved in the market, either as consumers and firms of the industry, are affected by the operation of the market. The effect may be beneficial or harmful. If it is benefit, we term it as positive externality. If it is harmful, it is termed as negative externality. If the externality is due to the activities of firms, they are called production externality. If the externality is arising due to consumer behavior, it is called consumption externality. Thus, we have a fourfold division of externalities as depicted, with examples, in Table 2.1. Table 2.1 Positive and negative externalities. Look at the screen. In the presence of externalities, markets fail to maximize welfare. This can be understood intuitively by noting that those affected by pollution bear a cost which is not accounted for in the costs borne by producers. Similarly, actions by some consumers, e.g. reducing waste and litter, could benefit other consumers who do not express this benefit by their WTP, since they do not pay for the cleaner surroundings. Thus, welfare losses and gains to people not participating in a particular market may reduce or increase social welfare. Negative production externality. Among the different types of externalities, the most common is that of negative production externality. This arises when, as a direct consequence of production, some losses or damages are incurred by persons other than the producing firms. For instance, the adverse impact of air pollution in Delhi and many other cities of North India has been attributed, among other causes, to the burning of crop residues by farmers in the adjoining states, regions. The producers of crops, farmers, find it cheaper to burn crop residues in the fields so that they can make the land ready for the sowing of next crop. But the adverse effects of air pollution affect adjacent cities. The urban population, especially children and elderly, are affected by various respiratory diseases. The enormous costs of treatment, damage to health, premature deaths, etc., impose a heavy economic cost to society that is not borne by the farmers. This example shows that the cost to producers is far less than the cost to society, which includes production costs plus damages. This can be shown by depicting the social marginal cost, SMC, lying above the private marginal cost, PMC, which are production costs borne by the producers. Fig. 2.2, look at the screen. Fig. 2.2, Market failure under negative production externality. The sum of producers' marginal costs is the supply curve. Similarly, the demand curve is the sum of WTP of consumers. In a freely competitive market, the equilibrium quantity Q will be produced and sold at the unit price P. But in case of negative externality, the total cost to society is greater than the costs borne by the producers, rendering P. An inefficient price level. The SMC is drawn parallel to the PMC by assuming that the marginal damage, MD, is constant. If this is not the case, and marginal damage increases as more is produced, then SMS will diverge further away from PMC. Since we are concerned with the costs to society, any output greater than K will add more to social cost than to benefit, or WTP. Producing more than K, such as Q, reduces welfare to the extent of RST. The market does not maximize welfare, which would be the case if only K is produced. This is a case of market failure. In the presence of negative externality, the efficient output is K and the maximum welfare attainable is the area CBR. The market reduces this welfare by the area RST and therefore it becomes a case of market failure. The result is quite common in real life. The pollution of Ganga and Yamuna is partly a result of industrial effluents being dumped into these rivers, making the water unhealthy and toxic. Likewise, when a farmer pumps out groundwater, the water table is reduced for all others in the adjacent areas. When a dam is built, it has enormous negative externalities in both the catchment and command areas, e.g. submersion, salinity, reduced flow downstream, relocation of people. Hence, big dams have been controversial. On the world scale, depletion of forests, global warming, ozone depletion, etc., have been attributed, in part, to negative production externalities. The total cost of these externalities are significant. For instance, the cost of air pollution globally is placed at $5 trillion annually. The amount spent on cleaning Ganga in the last 5 years has been over Rs 4,000 crore, and yet it continues to be unclean. For a solution to this problem, we again turn to Fig. 2.2. The Fig. shows that the social welfare maximizing output is K, and the corresponding price is P. What the government can do is to impose a tax on the producers of an amount equal to that of marginal damage. This will shift the MC curve of producers and equate it to the SMC. With the new supply curve equal to SMC, the market will produce the output K, removing market failure. Such a tax is known as the Pigouvian tax. As an alternative, the government can resort to regulation and cap the price at P or impose a cap on production quantity, i.e. not more than K can be produced. Similar results can be obtained by different sets of policy instruments. Positive consumption externality, a polar opposite of negative production externality, is the case of positive consumption externality. This arises when others are positively impacted, i.e. benefit, from the consumption activity of some consumers. An example is the efforts by some households in rainwater harvesting. The efforts will make more water available to all the households by recharging groundwater, thereby benefiting all in the locality. Another example is primary education, which brings benefits not only to the family but to the entire neighborhood by promoting hygiene, better behavior, etc. The central point of these examples is that the marginal benefit to society, MBS, is greater than the private marginal benefit, as expressed by their WTP, Fig. 2.3. The market will underproduce the commodity at Q, whereas the efficient, i.e. welfare maximizing, output is K. By producing less, the market causes a welfare loss equal to the area TRS. The solution to this case of market failure could be a subsidy equal to marginal benefit, MB, so as to push the demand curve upwards, making it coincide with the MBS curve. Alternatively, regulation or public provisioning could be considered. This is the reason why governments often subsidize primary education, primary health, immunization, renewable energy use, sanitation, rainwater harvesting, etc. In other words, public provisioning is resorted to by the government as a remedy to market failure by extending the reach of social benefits by positive consumption of such goods. Look at the screen. 2.3.2 Imperfect competition. Imperfectly competitive markets fail to maximize welfare. The limiting case of the imperfect market is monopoly. We therefore use the case of monopoly to illustrate how markets fail under imperfect competition. Since the monopolist is the only supplier, the demand curve is also the average revenue, AR, of the monopolist. Since the marginal revenue, Mr. curve of a monopolist lies below his AR curve, the monopolist produces Q amount, Fig. 2.4, since it maximizes his profit, where MC equals MR. But the welfare maximizing quantity is K, where MC equals WTP. We assume that there are no externalities. The profit maximizing output Q is sold at price P, which is higher than what a perfectly competitive market would have reached. The monopolist, therefore, can increase the price and reduce quantity to maximize profits. This leads to welfare loss of area TSR as less than efficient. Output, K, is produced. Since society's WTP greater than MC, cost to society, for outputs up to K, welfare is lost, and this becomes a case of market failure. Empirical studies have estimated such welfare loss, with some estimates for USA placing the loss at 3 to 5% of GDP. These studies have accounted for factors like inefficiency, loss of productivity, suppression of competition, etc. Studies for developing countries, by taking just allocative efficiency, have estimated the welfare loss to be substantial. For instance, a study of Mexican telecom monopolist estimates the loss as nearly 2% of the country's GDP for the period 2005 to 09. Note that this was from only one company. To deal with the negative impact of monopoly and other imperfectly competitive markets, public policy has favored the following instruments: I. Anti-monopoly laws that seek to promote competition, E. Regulation of monopolies through price controls, and E. State-owned enterprises in case of natural monopolies. Look at the screen. Fig. 2.4, Imperfect competition and market failure. 2.3.3 Public goods. Public goods represent an extreme form of externality. Pure public goods are defined by the absence of two qualities possessed by private goods. First, they are non-rival in consumption, meaning that the consumption of the good by one consumer does not reduce the amount available for consumption by other consumers. For instance, if street light is used by one pedestrian, it is also available to others. Clean air is another example. Second, public goods are non-excludable. This means that it is available to all. For instance, a good neighborhood public park provides a pleasing view to all. Similarly, if a country is well defended from external aggression, then all of its citizens enjoy security. The simultaneous existence of these two characteristics define a pure public good. But if only one of these two characteristics hold, we have cases of impure public goods, as in Table 2.2. As in the case of positive externalities, markets fail to produce the optimum quantity of public goods. In the case of positive externality, we noted that the market underproduces. In the case of a pure public good, the market may not produce anything at all. This can be intuitively understood. For instance, if a private producer produces a pure public good, e.g. fireworks for the city, it is instantly available to all consumers to enjoy, non-excludability, and therefore he cannot parcel it and sell in discrete bundles. If he were to ask the residents of the small town how much they are willing to pay for the fireworks, and collect the amount from them for a specified quantity of fireworks, it is unlikely to cover the costs. This is because residents will underreport their WTP. Non-rival consumption means that if anyone pays for fireworks, everyone can enjoy even without paying, i.e. free riding is allowed. Thus, left to private markets, pure public goods will be undersupplied. This is the reason why defense, law and order, fire services, etc. are provided by government. Such public goods are funded by public exchequer. Market failure in case of such public goods can be graphically illustrated. Fig. 2.5. Since a public good is non-rival in consumption, the benefit to society, MSB, is the vertical sum of WTP curves of its members. In other words, if WTP for one member of society is X1 for, say, the city police force of a given size, and for another member of society it is X2, then MSB is X1 by 2 for the force of the given size. The society maximizes its welfare if K quantity of the public good is provided. However, consumers may reveal a much lower WTP, shown by the lower MSB curve, due to free rider Problem. The actual production is car and therefore the working of the market would cause a welfare loss of area TSR. Public goods therefore cause the markets to fail to produce the optimum output. It is difficult to quantify this loss, but it is indicative enough to note that, in general, countries with a low tax GDP ratio, taken as proxy of countries' ability to provide public goods, are also the least developed ones. Table 2.2, PONM Pure Public Goods. Fig. 2.5, Market Failure in Case of Pure Public Good. Look at the screen. 2.3.4 Asymmetric Information. Perfectly competitive markets work under the assumption of perfect information, i.e., all parties have all the information. This means, no party, e.g. seller, has private information in the sense that others, e.g. consumers, are not aware of them. But when this assumption is violated, we have the case of asymmetric information. In such situations, it is possible that the sellers may have some information about the quality of the product sold, which is not known to the buyers. This causes market failure in the sense that welfare is no longer optimum. Literature distinguishes two main types of information failures. The first is called moral hazard. This is also known by the names hidden action, principal agent, or simply the agency problem. Under this, one party, usually the principal, cannot observe the actions of the agent. For instance, the employer cannot observe how much and what quality of effort the employee is putting in. The second case of information failure arises when one party of the transaction, buyer or seller, has some information which the other party does not have. These are instances of asymmetric information before the contract or exchange, which could lead to adverse selection. We can illustrate this by taking the recent case of Boeing 737 MAX, a passenger plane that ran its first trial in 2016. The plane was grounded worldwide in March 2019 following two crashes in October 2018 and March 2019, in which nearly 350 people died. Investigations revealed that the plane had design defects which the company sought to counteract with a software. The details of this was not made available to either the regulators or to the airlines, and hence resulted in a case of information asymmetry. Had the commercial airlines known the full details, they would not have purchased the aircrafts. In other words, with full information, the demand for these planes would have been much lower. But since the airlines had no information, they placed order, i.e. demand was high. The same applies for passengers. The situation is depicted in Fig. 2.6. Here, MSB1 shows the situation when consumers are not aware of the negative impact of the product. Had they known about it, their WTP would have been lower to MSB2, reflecting the actual situation. Because of this information asymmetry, market produces Q quantity whereas the efficient quantity is K. Therefore, the operation of the market causes a welfare loss equal to area TSR due to misallocation of resources to produce more of the defective good. This is not an uncommon situation, and you can think of similar cases, e.g. medical drugs, vehicles, about which we commonly read. As the airplane case shows, the tragic costs can be enormous. In addition to loss of life and property, the after effects of the case has led to huge compensation, e.g. payouts, collapse of Boeing stocks, fall in demand, and even impact on USA's GDP. The solution to this is to bring in the government-appointed regulators. But quite often, such regulators and the government also fail to set the problem right. Then, it becomes government failure. 2.4 Government failure. In the major part of the previous century, economists not only knew about the different aspects of market failure but had faith in the government's ability to rectify market failures. The first half of the century saw the dominant view that when markets fail, a benign and capable government can do what it should do, i.e. correct for market failure. The government or state was seen as a black box, wherein you input market failure and the output was efficiency. This is a normative way of looking at cure for market failures in the hands of a government which ought to be able to do what it is supposed to do. From the middle of the century, more and more analysis focused on the positive question of how the government actually functions and not on the normative Question of how it should function. The questions that were asked were I. What is the government? E. How does it decide? E. What are the motivations of persons in the government when they decide? IV. How does the government take its decisions? And finally, V. Does all of this lead to efficiency, i.e. welfare maximization? To the question on what is the government, economists noted that in modern democracies, the government is made up of elected politicians and appointed bureaucrats. It was postulated that these sets of people are no different from other economic agents as they too pursued their self-interests. For instance, the politician's principal objective is to get re-elected. A related and crucial question, therefore, is how voting systems work and what are their results? The analysis began with a stylized direct democracy which sought to study how individual preferences are aggregated to obtain decisions at the societal level. This was the crux of the social choice theory. 2.4.1 Direct democracy. Under direct democracy, the citizens take the decisions. Let us imagine a small town with 3,000 voters equally divided into three groups: elders, young parents, and others. The town has to decide on spending rupees 100 crore for a project. Suppose the choice is between only two projects, a hospital or a school. Then the choice can easily be made by putting the proposal to vote. Whichever proposal gets more than 50% of votes could be chosen. In almost every such case, a decision can be reached. This is called the majority rule, which works when the choice is between only two alternatives. But if we increase the alternatives to more than two, a clear result which simultaneously satisfies some fundamental rational principles may not be possible. To observe this, let us introduce the third project as a sports stadium. The three types of voters' preferences would be as shown in Table 2.3. Look at the screen. Table 2.3, decision under three choices. If all three projects are put to vote, then the voters shall express their first preferences and each project may get 1,000 votes each, i.e. a tie. If, however, 5 of the others group vote for hospital, then the project may be chosen by the voting method called first by the post, as it gets the largest number of votes. But this is not very desirable as nearly 2/3 of the voters do not have hospital as their first preference. It therefore violates the majority principle. Further, it does not take into consideration voters' preferences for the other projects. To rectify this, we may choose the voting system of taking any two projects at a time. Let us say the first vote is a choice between hospital or stadium, where 2,000 voters, elders and young parents, prefer hospital to stadium, and hospital wins in the first round. If the second round of voting is between hospital and school, school might win if young parents and others prefer school to hospital. So, can we declare school as the winner? If a vote is taken between school and stadium, stadium will be the winner with elders and others preferring this to school. So no rational decision can be reached. This contradiction does not depend on the order in which projects are taken up, pair-wise, for voting. Can we then change the voting rule? For instance, the first preference can be given a weight of 3, the second preference a weight of 2 and third a weight of 1. The voters are asked to declare their preferences over all the projects. The weights are then multiplied by the number of votes. In our example, hospital will get 1,000 times 3, 1,000 times 1, 1,000 times 2 points from the three groups. This type of voting is called Borda count. But, as was proved by Arrow, 1951, getting a reasonable result under any voting system may not be possible. This is the result from the famous Arrow's impossibility theorem. Arrow's theorem begins with a few self-evident conditions, called axioms. These are: I, voters have clear ranking over various alternatives and these rankings are transitive and unrestricted. E, the ranking of any two projects is not affected by the inclusion or exclusion of a third alternative. E, if a project makes someone better off without making anyone worse off, it must be chosen. And IV, the social ordering should not be decided by anyone else. Arrow's theorem showed that under these assumptions it is impossible to derive a consistent social choice that is also preferred to every other project, if we take more than two projects at a time. If a project in pair-wise comparison is preferred to every other project, we call it the Condorcet winner. Arrow showed that in cases where there are two or more voters choosing between three or more alternatives, we can get a consistent result, i.e. a Condorcet winner, only if we impose restrictions on individual preferences. It was later shown by Black, 1948, that if the individual preferences are all single-peaked, a consistent outcome is theoretically possible. Let us change the preferences in our small town to the following, Table 2.4. Table 2.4, Ordered Public Preferences. Look at the screen. In the above ordering, we have altered the preference of young parents only. If we compare the two sets of preferences graphically, Fig. 2.7, it will become clear that now the preferences have become single-peaked, earlier preference YP1. Current preferences YP2. Fig. 2.7, achieving single-peaked preference with changed ordering. Look at the screen. The above illustration shows that with suitable restrictions, it is possible to obtain a consistent result by aggregating individual choices to obtain a social choice. By taking pair-wise projects, we can ensure fulfilling what is called the criterion of transitivity. In this case, this means that stadium will be preferred to school, school will be preferred to hospital, and stadium will be preferred to hospital. Note that these results are exactly the same as what the middle group chooses. The single-peaked restriction actually leads to an important theorem called the median voter theorem. The theorem states that, in case of a single-peaked preference, the median voter is the deciding factor. To simplify, if a group of 1001 voters were to decide on whether or not to celebrate an event, then the choice of the 501st voter will decide the outcome. Thus, a decision can be reached under certain assumptions in a direct democracy. But will the decision be efficient? Not necessarily. This is because efficiency relates to welfare, which is defined as the difference between society's WTP and the cost to society. In our earlier example, suppose 501 voters decide on celebrating the occasion. The decision is then in favor of the celebration. Suppose 500 voters are opposed to the celebration and are not willing to pay anything, whereas the supporters are willing to pay rupees 100 each. The total WTP is rupees 50,100. If the cost of celebration is rupees 1 lakh, the result is an inefficient one because the costs are greater than WTP. Direct democracies, therefore, do not often offer the scope to reach consistent decisions unless some conditions are satisfied by the individual preference functions. Even if they do arrive at a consistent decision, there is no guarantee that the decision shall be welfare maximizing. 2.4.2 Representative democracy. It is, however, true that in most democracies, decisions are taken by representatives elected by the people for a fixed period. In such indirect democracies, politicians and political parties seek the votes of the people not with the idea of making policies that enhance welfare but with the sole objective of getting elected again to enjoy power. Politicians, like any other economic agent, are guided by self-interest and not by altruism. As Downes, 1957, pointed out, parties formulate policies in order to win elections, rather than win elections to formulate policies. It is here that the median voter theorem becomes relevant. If there are two parties or candidates, and the voting is about one important issue, e.g. the amount of public expenditure on poverty alleviation program, then it is the median voter who will be the deciding voter in the election. Let us depict the relative frequency of voters on the vertical axis and the amount of money per capita to be spent on poverty alleviation programs on the horizontal axis, Fig. 2.8. Since there are only two parties, one of the two parties must get more than 50% of the votes in order to win. The amount M divides the distribution in two equal halves. It is thus clear that in order to win, a political party must promise an expenditure level close to M, like R, and not a level far away from M like L. The Political parties therefore will gravitate towards promising M in order to win elections. In other words, parties are compelled to make policies in order to win elections and not the other way. Fig. 2.8 Distribution of voters as per proposed expenditure level. Look at the screen. As in the case of direct democracy, here also there is no guarantee that this level of expenditure R will be welfare maximizing. This is because it actually depends on society's WTP and the cost of the project or program. Representative democracies are also therefore not entirely free from the defect of autocracies in that they too indulge in wasteful expenditures. Quite often, they go in for grandiose plans like statues, tallest building, bid for Olympics, etc., even when the economy is not rich enough. Further, the median voter theorem may not be valid if the assumptions underlying it are violated. The first such assumption is that the voting is on a single dimension or issue, like amount to be spent on poverty alleviation programs. But in reality, elections are fought on multiple dimensions like defense, inequality, social security, etc., all of which may or may not be correlated. The second assumption is that there are only two candidates, which also is mostly violated. A third implicit assumption is that politicians have full information about the distribution of voters' preference, which also may not be completely accurate. The most significant violation arises from the fact that there are extraneous issues, other than voters' preference, that influence the politicians' behavior. One of these is money to contest elections. Elections are very expensive as they involve media advertisements, posters, transportation, manpower mobilization, air transport, etc. For instance, as per one estimate, the general elections of 2019 in India saw an aggregate expenditure of about 60,000 crores by political parties, or approximately 100 crore per parliamentary constituency. The winning party obviously has to spend the most. It in fact spent an amount equal to what all other parties together spent. This situation is not unique to India. Even as far back as in 2000, the winner of US elections was estimated to have spent $185 million to get elected. Clearly, such huge magnitude of political funding can come only from the very rich. The rich business and industrial houses therefore have a powerful leverage in influencing policy. They become close to politicians, and if such relationships are not kept in check, it often degenerates into what is called crony capitalism, where policies are made not for social welfare but for partisan interests of the rich. In addition to money, ideology also plays a role so that policies may deviate from social preferences. A corollary to the above is that policies may not be consistent in representative democracies due to reasons such as absence of single-peakedness, violation of median voter theorem assumptions, role of money, etc. There is evidence that new elected regimes often undo some of the policies undertaken by previous regimes, even though these are preferred by the electorate. Finally, representative democracies also exhibit what has come to be known as political business cycles. Since the primary objective of the incumbent government is to get re-elected, it spends more on populist schemes before elections. After elections, budget strings are tightened and flow of policy tends to favor those who funded the elections. This is of course not the classical political business cycle proposed by Northerns, but it conveys the gist of that theory in the context of democracy in a developing country. There is ample empirical evidence in support of the political business cycle theory. This points to significant departure from welfare maximizing policies that ought to be pursued by the government. In other words, the political parties that run the government pursue self-interest before efficiency. 2.4.3 Bureaucracy and inefficiency. Bureaucracy in democracies are the more permanent structures of governance. Although under the presidential form, the top level may change with the government. The tasks of the bureaucracy are I. Implement acts, laws, and policies of the government, e. Formulate rules and regulations under the acts, and e. Implement regulatory and development roles through provision of public and merit goods. It usually comprises of a permanent set of officials. How efficient will the bureaucracy be in the provision of public goods and Services is an important question to which an economic theory of bureaucracy, developed by Niskanang, provides an answer. Although this theory was developed in the context of USA, where the bureaucracy is somewhat different from India, its logic can be related to the Indian context with some modification. Let us take the case of a municipality and its department charged with garbage removal, waste disposal and cleanliness. In government departments, unlike in the private sector, the marginal cost of output is rarely seen. If the department shows more work is to be done, it can ask for more budget allocation. The bureaucrat therefore is a budget maximizing agent. The higher the budget, more is the power commanded by the bureaucrat and more is the prestige, facilities and personnel he commands. The bureau, therefore, pushes output to a point where MSB equals average cost and not marginal cost, Fig. 2.9. We assume that MSB is the real one, which is not known to the municipal bosses. The department heads, interested in maximizing budget, will produce QB amount and not the welfare maximizing amount of K. The welfare loss, as before, is the area TSR. Look at the screen. Fig. 2.9, Bureaucracy's cost-benefit scenario. The bureaucrats also run the regulatory agencies and functions of the government. Here again, government failure is argued in terms of theories of regulatory capture and rent-seeking. For instance, take the case of telecom sector. Suppose the telecom companies have approached the regulator for a small increase in call rates. The overwhelming majority of consumers will not bother to fight against this because the cost to each one is not large. Further, approaching the regulator and presenting a case against the hike is costly for individuals as they have to gather data, build a case, mobilize scattered consumers, etc. The gain is too little compared to costs for individual consumers. But the telecom operators' gain may run into crores of rupees even with a slight tariff hike. It therefore will mobilize accountants, lawyers, public relation agencies to make a powerful case in front of the regulator. The regulator, faced with a strong case from operators and a weak or non-existent case from consumers, is likely to rule in favor of a tariff hike. This is an example of regulatory capture. The case for regulatory capture gets bolstered when we note that the regulator often is short of staff, short of expertise, and most certainly lack the knowledge of operations and costs that the telecom companies have. This is also an example of asymmetric information undermining the efficiency of regulation. Recall the case of regulatory failure mentioned with regard to Boeing 737 MAX before. Sometimes, government policies actually help the creation and continuation of monopolies, since government controls often create shortages. These situations lead to the emergence of rents. The firms often put in efforts to capture this rent. The firms may use public relations, advertisements, lobbying and even pay bribes to capture the rent, or make the government policy move towards creation of rent. Some people therefore call excessively restrictive laws as traps for making money. Prohibition, for instance, caused the rise of mafia in the USA. The license and permit Raj in the pre-liberalization India caused severe inefficiencies as economic agents spent money and effort for rent-seeking rather than for production. The Mexican telecom example is another relevant case. Rent-seeking activities are therefore closely related to corruption. The bureaucrat has a chance to be corrupt when restrictive laws give him excessive discretion. This also applies to politicians. If the bureaucrat finds that the bribe is large and the chances of discovery and conviction are low, corruption will increase. This adversely affects investment, growth and income distribution. The costs calculated by numerous studies are substantial. Finally, the government has shown a tendency to expand. Politicians and bureaucrats do not like to give up power and command over resources. Further, if you have more people in the government, you need more people to keep records of the employees, process their salaries, etc. Hence, bureaucracies have a tendency to expand. Economists who believe in government failure therefore seek to control the size of the government by placing restrictions on its expansion in the constitution or some law. For instance, India enacted the fiscal reforms in Budget Management Act whose main intention is to put speed breakers on the expansion of government. 2.5 Summary. Market failure arise due to factors like externality, imperfect competition, public goods and asymmetric information. In all these cases, production is away from the optimal level. Ideally, government should be able to step in and rectify anomalies, enabling the markets to work efficiently. However, government too consists of agents whose focus is to maximize their personal gains at the cost of social welfare. Thus, quite often, the government too fails. Various instruments like subsidies to promote consumption of merit goods, production by government, price and quantity caps, etc., are adopted with varying levels of success to deal with the issues of market and government failure. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with the next chapter.